But then I thought, oh.
These words are the words of the native people from this area. And what I said was "Wiat," which means hello. And then I said, welcome. They said, hey, welcome to this big house of the Duwamish. Pa'apus is his name. Yayu Stokes teach da. Yayu Stokes means work, and Stokes means man. So this is my name. My English name, Workman, is the same as my Lashutsi name. Ken Workman. Ataduabs, and I am of the Duwamish tribe. Akwaye, Siab, Siab, and great grandson of Chief Seattle. And so just as my grandfather stood on the shores of Alki 172 years ago, and he said, Slaleo Isiai. Slaleo, it means come ashore. Come ashore, my friends. Adita Parate Alok Dawabs. Come ashore onto this ancient land of the Duwamish. Duyi. This word means welcoming. And this is how he welcomed people here. And that's the day that the world turned upside down for us. But that's another story. This place where you are today and these woods behind you are precious woods to the Duwamish. This place is the last village site in Seattle. And this place was burned down in 1893. And so we as Duwamish are beginning to recover this land and buy it back. And so the parking lots to the north of us we just acquired. And so hopefully you found it easy to park. Wasn't always that way. And the woods behind the house here, they've been logged, and maybe Judy can help me out with this, once. And so these woods are relatively fresh. This hill is relatively fresh, and you have to remember that this city, for the previous 10,000 years prior to my grandfather welcoming people here, had been the same forever and ever and ever and ever. The river twisted and wound, the hills were green, the creeks they flowed, the elk they wandered, the deer, the bear, eagles, salmon. And so when you're in this place and you're in these woods, you're still walking amongst the native people. And I say that because my background is from the Boeing company in aerospace. I retired out of flight operations engineering. And so my science lens has me looking at the world from that perspective. My DNA lens has me looking at the world from our family's perspective. And there is no conflict in either. So when I say to you that Chief Seattle's request, when he was signing this treaty to give away all this land in 1855, was to have unencumbered access to our burial grounds. And so if you put your science hat on, you'll know what he was talking about was that when we would pass away for 1,000 years and the 10,000 years before that, that we would pass away in these hills right behind you, and the hills and the valleys around Seattle here. And all that material that was grandpa and grandma and aunties and uncles goes down into the ground. And then when the springtime comes, the spring rains come and things start to come alive again. And we know that from the flowering currant berries right outside the longhouse here. You can see them. And this is how you know spring is here. Things start to turn green, these currants start to come out. That when that happens, all the stuff that was in the ground, which is grandma and grandpa and aunties and uncles and all those Duwamish people, migrate back up into the trees through the mycorrhizal fungi that's in the ground and the relationship it has with the roots of the trees. And so the Duwamish people are in these woods behind you. They're in the wood of buildings like this. And when we talk like that, we're talking about at a molecular level. And so when we say our houses have souls, that's because grandma and grandpa are in the house, literally in the wood. And that this place that you're on was the last place in Seattle. And so when we talk about our relationship with the world and the environment, this is what we're talking about. In modern sense, grandma and grandpa continue to sequester the carbon out of the air, and they keep the planet green. So when I say which simply means welcome, my friends, to this big house of the Duwamish. This is where you are, and this is what this place means to us. So just as my grandfather stood on the shores of Alki 172 years ago, and he said, come ashore, my friends, onto this land. We say the same thing today. And today we say we hit on, because the world is a much smaller place. And so we invite everybody, and that you should know that you are welcome here and that you're appreciated here. And so thank you for that. And I look forward to conversing with you, and know that you are welcome onto this land of the Duwamish and this big house called headwaters. That, thank you.
Thank you, Ken. And thank you all for being here. We're thrilled with the turnout. It's a fantastic opportunity to offer this hybrid program where we're getting you all outside on Earth Day, and thankfully a dry Earth Day, and then back here for some little fashion history. And my name is Elizabeth Rudrud. I'm the Programs and Community Outreach Director with the Southwest Seattle Historical Society. And again, very honored to have everybody here today. Thank you to the Duwamish Tribe and the Duwamish Tribe Cultural Center and Longhouse for hosting us here. When we started talking about this program, we were sort of thinking about locations of where we could host a panel discussion, and this one came up very quickly, and we knew this was the ideal spot. So we're very glad to be able to root this conversation here at the Longhouse. Also to our wonderful hike volunteers from Widget, y'all want to raise your hands? It was just joyous, and we kept having to add more and more guys as we saw the registration numbers going up. So hope y'all had fun with those groups. And of course, thank you to Ken, Tom, and Kirsty, and Judy here, who's our moderator, for joining us on our panel today. The Southwest Seattle Historical Society has a mission to preserve local history through education, preservation, and advocacy. This was a great program for us to get started on because, well, personally, I didn't know much of the history of the Greenbelt, and I still don't, so I'm very much looking forward to the conversation today. But it was a great opportunity for us to start collecting these stories and getting them into our historical record. So we hope you all enjoy the conversation today. After today's event, we'll be sending you out a survey to ask how your experience was and how we can improve. So we greatly appreciate you guys keeping an eye out on your emails for our post-program survey, and feel free to connect with me directly through that email if you want to have further conversations. And with that, I'm going to pass it along to Judy, our gracious moderator today. Thank you.
So I'm Judy Bentley, and I'm a member of the West Duwamish Greenbelt Trails group. And actually, I like to see the hands of that group work down too. Some of us have t-shirts, but we run out. Steve, yes. Craig, Joanne in the back, Christine, yes, and Robert. All right, we'll be hearing from these folks, so, although you've already heard from some of them. So we developed from a coterie of neighborhood activists and some faculty at South Seattle College. We wanted to activate the Greenbelt, this unknown place, invisible to many in the city. We wanted to support forest restoration, advocate for trails, and promote a cultural connection between the neighborhoods at the top of the ridge, the schools, Pathfinder School, South Seattle College, and the Duwamish Longhouse, and a connection to the river, which is our history too. So for almost 10 years, we've been doing this. We have work parties. We have some guided hikes, and we're trying to increase public awareness. So that's why you're here, right? The public, we're increasing your awareness. More recently, we've been working with many other groups, and one of the slides on this, it's not timed right, but you'll see a whole list of groups who come together with the Duwamish tribe, led by the Duwamish tribe, to try and establish a bridge to river trail, R2R we call it, from the Longhouse through the Greenbelt to the top of the ridge. And as many of you hike that today, you may have seen what some of the obstacles are, both seen and unseen, the ones you crossed and the kiln dust that you did not cross, because we would avoid that. But we have done a feasibility study that TUR has for such a trail, and we'll be working on that. Anyone is welcome to join us. We're a volunteer group. We have no staff. We meet once a month, the second Tuesday, 7 o'clock by Zoom. And all you have to do is find us on Facebook. We have a website, www.dgtrails.com. Come to our meetings. If you give us your Gmail address, we'll send you to or your email address. We'll send you to the we'll send you notice of the meetings. But we'd love to have more folks. We need help guiding trails because I think there's a lot of interested people who would like to go on the trails. So today many of you have become acquainted with Greenbelt. Some of you lived here, you know it well. Others may be your first time today. What we want to do for the rest of the program is fill in not just the timeline history, which we put together, but the personal experiences of people who have lived near the Greenbelt, grown up in it, watched it change. And we've invited 3 panelists to start the discussion. And then we're going to invite you all to contribute. We have a microphone that will go into the audience. And by the way, this is being recorded. because we want to add this information to the historical record. If you do not want to be recorded, just say that when we call on you, and we can edit you out. But our goal is to collect a personal and oral history of the Greenbelt, in addition to the documents and the history that we know well enough to put on the timeline. So I'm going to introduce our panelists just one by one, roughly in chronological order, which does not mean by age necessarily, but those starting with, as you know, the person whose ties have probably been here the longest, Kim Bergman, and then Kirsten Mule and Tom Rasmussen. And so I'll introduce those individually as we go. So we're going to start with Ken. He's already given us a good introduction to the Greenbelt. And as he's told you, he's fifth generation grandson of Chief Seattle, retired from Boeing Company's Flight Operations Engineering Group, where he worked as a systems and data analyst. He's a council member of the Duwamish Tribe, board president of Duwamish Tribal Services, a nonprofit arm of the Duwamish Tribe, and Ken grew up right next to the Greenbelt. So that's what we'd like to hear.
Well, I already told you who I am. What I didn't tell you was that I was born on the shores of Elliott Bay, on the western shores, across the street from the Salty Restaurant down there. But when I was 4, my family moved up here on the 21st Avenue where Dawson and 21st enters at. And so from the late 50s to the 60s, into the 1970s, these woods were the woods that my brothers and I played in. My sister, she was brand new, so she didn't really get a chance to go out there. We made rope swings out there. We played in the creek that's right out here, Puget Creek. We made camps throughout the woods. We found things, we discovered things. And of course, when you're a small child and you're walking around in here, you know that nobody has been in these woods ever as a human being until you were there. The woods, when I left, and that would be 1969, my family moved to the north end of Seattle. And so I'd been away from these woods for a long, long time, for about 50 years or so. And then a number of years I came back, and I was stunned how they hadn't changed. And so when I came back into the woods, and this must have been about 8 years ago now, I entered from Dawson and 19th Avenue. And there is now an improved trail. It's got gravel on it that comes down into these woods. And the creek is still there, and the cliffs are still there, and the gray clay is still there, and the trees. Lots of things have grown up, but the basic shape is still there. And the black cottonwoods, the very same ones that were lined with blue heron, they're still there. The heron nests aren't, but the trees are still there. The very same trees that I remember as a small child in the 1960s. And what really caught my attention was as the sun was setting and I was out in these woods, as I said, 8 years ago, that would be whatever it was, 15, something like that, 2015, that when the sun was setting, July sun, that the mist from the ground was rising. All of the birds and the chipmunks were chirping, and they were all screaming, nighttime is coming, it's time to come home. And I went, they're still here. I could still, the birds are still here, the squirrels are still here, the wind is still here, the breeze is in the trees, and the smell, it's still here. These woods haven't changed. In all of those years I've been away, with all of the improvements that have gone on in Seattle, these woods are the same. And so I was just honored to be walking in those woods, smelling that smell and hearing those things, and knowing that as the sunset is coming, I should probably get out of the woods. So So in the meantime, I moved on in society. I acquired jobs like everybody else does. And today I'm back here on the shores of the Duwamish River where I learned to swim in this river. Our method of swimming was my mom just threw my brother and I in and said, fend for yourself. And clearly that worked because I'm here. And then of course, all of these woods were just go out and play. And so I ended up being a country boy and I didn't know it, raised in the city. But as soon as I became an adult and moved out and moved into an apartment, I found there were entirely too many people. And so I had to move and go back in the country, realizing only then that it was these woods right here where I grew up that turned me into the person that I was a country boy.
Thank you. Great, great feeling. I wish I had grown up here too. Tom Rasmussen has worked for preservation and acquisition of greenbelt parks and open space in Seattle for decades. In the 1980s, he was legislative assistant to Seattle City Council member Jeanette Williams, who was a strong advocate for parks and open spaces and protection of the hillside greenbelts in West Seattle, Queen Anne, and other neighborhoods. And he'll probably tell us more about that. He was elected to the Seattle City Council in 2003, chair of the Parks and Seattle Center, the Seattle Center Committee. He led to the development of the voter approved levy, which raised $145 million for the Parks Department. Funding included $36 million for neighborhood park and green space acquisition. After 12 years and 3 terms in the City Council, it doesn't happen as much these days, Tom happily retired at the end of 2015, and he has lived in West Seattle for over 20 years. And we hope he will tell us about his civic involvement with Greenbelt.
Thank you, Judy. You can hear me talk about growing up in this area, playing in the woods and running around and enjoying all that you can enjoy with woods in that natural area. It reminded me of when I grew up in the east side in what became Bellevue. My family moved to, we call it the east side now, but we moved to the woods in Bellevue in about 1954. And it was just woods, streams, even little waterfalls and trees. And we lived in what was an RV barracks that had been converted into a single family home in the woods. And around us developed lake hills. And we saw the streams being covered up or put into culverts. We saw the trees being cut down. And even then, when you're only in 4th grade or 3rd grade, you know you're losing something really, really special. What you're able to enjoy here didn't just happen by chance. There's been a long history of the city really wanting to preserve these greenbelts. As early as in the mid-1950s, what was then called the Planning Commission said they wanted to have a system of greenbelts throughout this city. And so that was aspirational. Nothing was done to make that happen, but they even identified this one and others. 7 were identified at that time. But it took a long time for the city to actually get around to taking formal action to protect those greenbelts. And finally, 20 years later, the city council adopted what they call a comprehensive plan that identified greenbelts. But that it only identified those greenbelts through a formal process called the city council resolution. And that called for regulation of the greenbelts. And the beginning of the development of the regulations didn't occur until about 6 years later. So during all of that time, the greenbelts were, for the most part, privately owned. Some were being developed, and some were falling down the hillside because many of these were in slide areas. Well, finally, in 1983, when I worked for Jeanette Williams, who was a member of the Seattle City Council at that time, as Judy said, I was her legislative assistant. And the mayor finally, I'm not blaming anyone, just passing and developing land use regulations is extremely technical and slow. And this was one of the last new land use regulations, the Greenbelt regulations. So I came to the council in 1983. And at that time, it proposed 14 greenbelts. But of those green belts, there were about 900 acres. Only about 250 acres were owned by the city. The rest were privately owned. Well, the Greenbelt regulations require that if you had a property in the Greenbelt, at least I think it was 30% had to be set aside in Greenbelt open space, basically undisturbed. That's on top of setbacks, side yards, and all those other requirements that a property owner has. Well, you can imagine what a property owner up here thought when he or she realized that their ability to develop that site has suddenly potentially shrunk by a lot. And for in some cases, some people own 10, 13, 15 acres in this greenbelt. And that was their retirement, that was their nest egg. They were depending upon being able to sell this in order to be able to retire. And so, as the council always does, we had, I was a staff member, I wasn't a council member then. There was a public hearing, there were 6 public hearings held by the mayor. There were several more held by the city council. And as you can imagine, those public hearings at City Hall were as packed as this room, if not more packed. So I, as a staff member, had to make sure everyone signed the sign-up sheet for the public hearing. And we had 5 of these. There were over 100 people testifying at the public hearings that would limit the development of this hillside significantly. Now, the interesting thing is, people said, we love greenbelts, we love the idea of greenbelts, we love our 14 greenbelts, but what do they add to that? But not my property, not in my yard. And so that's what the challenge was, is that everyone loves greenbelts, but it's not in their yard or not their yard, because they were concerned it affected its economic value. Well, the council eventually did pass the legislation in 1984. And of course, as you can imagine, lawsuits immediately, because there is a constitutional concept called taking. You cannot take, the government cannot take someone's property without compensating for them for it. And there is a way of taking property by regulating it so tightly that is seen as a taking of their property. So what people said in this lawsuit, they said, these regulations are a taking. My property is so closely and tightly regulated that it has no value anymore. And a court agreed. In 1986, 2 years after the legislation was passed, the court said, yes, that is a taking, and you need to go back to the drawing board and revise those regulations. So 2 years later, more public hearings before Jeanette Williams' committee, legislation was revised. And I think it's probably the legislation that controls now. I'm not sure, it might have been, it's been amended over the years, but usually it's kind of tweaking adjustments, and it provided a lot more flexibility. It reduced the amount of land that had to be set aside as undisturbed greenbelt in these areas. So it's kind of a compromise, a win-win. As Judy said, I became a city council member in 2003, and one of the things that motivated me to be a city council member was that incredibly rewarding experience of being able to do something for your community, especially with regard to the environment. And I very much wanted to be the parks chair, and I was the chair of the parks committee just when a parks levy was expiring in 2008. And at that time, this was really interesting. At that time, Marshall may remember this. We had to either renew that levy or let those funds that would used to be available go away. And I said, well, we have to renew the levy. But someone said to me on the council that the mayor doesn't want to renew the levy. And the reason why is that there was going to be a measure on the ballot to fund the renovation of the Pike Place Market. We can't have 2 measures on the ballot costing people money. They both might fail. But I thought that the support for our environment, support for our greenbelts and parks was so strong, and the love of our Pike Place Market was too, that I thought we could successfully. And the voters did approve that. And it was a 6-year levy, $145 million. And we put significant emphasis on acquisition because we knew that Seattle was going to grow. We know that we need green space. We know that we need to have parks. And so we used a significant amount of those funds for acquisition. Of course, the Parks Department just is really stretched thin, just have money for maintenance of what they have. So what we heard from our staff is that we can barely take care of what we have. You want us to buy more acres? You want us to create more parks? And the answer is yes. Because you can't, once it's gone, once it's developed, you really can't get it back. And so I thought we had to take that opportunity to acquire as much land as possible. There was a great article in the Westdale Herald. Some of you may have seen it. I've made copies of it. It talks about how a landowner named Betty Leary, I don't know if any of you knew her. Betty's in her late 90s now. She lives in Edmonds. She owned 13 acres right over here. And so here's a picture of Betty. I'll pass this around. Jeanette Williams, me with my mustache. It got too gray, so I just finally decided I shaved it off. And then one of the staff members of the Department of Land Use. So she wanted out of it. She, again, loved Greenbelt, but just not her property. So this is, maybe you just pass that to the audience. It's really, and the person that wrote that article is Clay Eels. 40 years ago, Clay Eels, Clay, he writes the Now and Then at the back of the Seattle Times. So I talked to Clay, I said, you still have that article? And of course he does. Now, one more thing before I finish my part of this is that there was a lot of drama at these public hearings. And I'll just read you one sentence that was that we received in a letter from the Queen Anne Community Council. The Queen Anne Community Council was very, very active in Greenbelt and Parks. And I happened to be the chair of the Queen Anne Parks Committee at that time that this was going on. But anyway, the Queen Anne Community Council said, this spring, Queen Anne's trees in the Aurora Greenbelt were under an upraised axe. We nearly lost most of those trees to the Great Dragon, 270 units of condominiums. But because the council passed this legislation, that was stopped. Well, because that was stopped, we got sued. But anyway, that was the drama. The Great Dragon of development was coming to chop down those trees. So what I wanted to conclude with you today is that it's really important to be active as you are now. There's so many competing needs in our city. There's so many challenges that if you don't emphasize to your city council members or to the mayor the importance of green spaces, parks, green belts, it won't happen, or they'll get very, very little in terms of city resources. So thank you for organizing this meeting. Thank all of you for advocating for our parks, for green belts. And I've already learned a lot today on my walking tour over there by the Duwamish. It was really fun and interesting. Thanks.
I realized I was supposed to give you an overview of the history of the Greenbelt, but we'll go on to the panelists and then I'll do that a bit, but it's been flashing on the screen there for you. You do have kind of distracted the attendee staff. So our third panelist is Kirsty Newell. She's an urban conservation specialist, wildlife first responder, science educator, and frequent contributor to local and national media. He concentrates on the intersectionality of wildlife and urban spaces, in particular the human-induced impacts on remaining natural spaces and the structural and political challenges that arise for both people and remaining biodiversity. She's a former consulting utility specialist and arborist and continues her involvement in urban arboriculture. She's recently appointed to Seattle's Urban Forestry Commission. Kirsty was born and raised in the natural area within the Greenbelt. Her father worked in the underground research lab located there. That's part of the history I was supposed to tell you. In exchange for housing for their family, so she may tell you that. Her experiences as a child profoundly impacted her and in great part made her who she is today, and we'd like to hear from her.
Let me know if you can hear me. I speak pretty quietly. Thank you for being here. I feel like I've been waiting my whole life to tell this story, and I'm really humbled to be doing anything in this space. We've got 3 generations here, my family, my nephew.
my sister and my mom. So in 1971, mom, to correct me, we moved, well, I wasn't born yet, but so they moved to Washington to work for Boeing. My dad, and then, yeah. It's the mask. Okay, so and my parents moved from Massachusetts to Washington, and my dad worked at Boeing. So he got laid off in 71. And then he found this unique job opportunity. So does everyone know where Pathfinder Elementary is? Okay, so there was an underground research lab there where the first humans were irradiated for cancer. And there was also, after that finished, they did the same research on mostly beagles, but some companion animals that had lymphoma. So underneath Pathfinder School, it's the lab.
Something was touched. It was a little bit better.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. So under the schools, it's that lab. It's on the walls are 4 feet of concrete and the roof is 9 feet. So it was a bomb shelter because the property was previously used for military. And when we lived there, and there were all the tuning huts and the radio towers and the lookout towers. And then when we were there, the beagles were down in there. So my dad kept the grounds and assisted. It was Dr. Thomas. So he actually won a Nobel Prize for that work in 1990. So for me to grow up in such a unique situation, it completely formed who I am today. I was a very shy child, and we had 44 acres to ourselves. And there was so much wildlife, and Ken was saying all the animals and the trees. And I have a different experience with animals, because there are animals that were there when I was a child that are not present today, and that is a direct correlation because of development in the surrounding areas. But the trees are still, as you said, they're still there. My dad planted a tree when I was born on the property, and it's still there, and I visit it frequently. So I know exactly how old it is. Not going to tell you how it is. But and my mom's rose bushes are still there, and the daffodils pop up in the spring. So there were, I specifically remember fox, which are not in West Seattle anymore. There were barn owls, since there's a lot of open space in there, and you'd fly with the white faces in the evening through the fields. And we had a great horned owl that sat outside the house. Some of my fondest memories, and how I formed my environmental ethic was because of my dad. He refused to mow the grounds in the summertime because there was a ground nesting sparrow that he didn't want to mow over. And so I started understanding that connection with the land and the others that were using it as well. The herons would roost on the lookout towers, and I remember quail running by. I think that was the first bird I learned, because I asked my dad why they had question marks on their heads. There's alligator lizards that are still there. They live in the rock piles. It was just a wildlife bonanza. And then I think as I was writing this, and I can't really remember anything now, but I figured out why I am who I am and why I do what I do. So there was that interface there when I was a child. There was the open fields that still have the military huts and the radio towers and the research lab. But right behind us, the Greenbelt, the house was right up against the Greenbelt, and there was all this wild space. But then underground,
there were prisoners, those dogs, and I hated going down there, I hated hearing them, I hated smelling it. So I think, and then when we had to move out of there in 81, I tried to build myself into the carport. I did not want to leave. It was traumatizing to move from such a wild and free space with so much life and to go to a neighborhood. And I think I keep in my mind somehow with the work I do, I keep trying to square that clash. Because I specialize with the problems that our urban species have with urbanization coming in and closer. And so I really struggled with that. And so I try to work with them, and because you either adapt and evolve or you fail to thrive. And humans have a lot more resources and ways of thriving, and animals don't. Like, the time that is requested of them to adapt is way too short. So we're losing a lot of our species. So I'm really grateful for the Greenbelt. Populants are also one of my favorite smell. My dad built me a long jump pit in the fields, and my sister made a concoction on some of the stumps called tʔáwi, and we would pretend to eat that, and just so many good memories. I could go on all day.
It was 10 years of pure joy for my children and myself. And like you said, when we had to leave there, it was like a house to go into the neighborhood. Yeah, and I, one, will be grateful to having been able to live there.
Yeah, and I think that's why I fight so hard, because every person deserves to have that experience, or a piece of that experience. Every child deserves green space and shade and pool and animals, because if you don't know the animals, if you don't know the trees, you don't care about them, and you cannot be an advocate for them.
Thank you. Thank you. All three of you have said a great tone for our discussion. And let me very quickly go through the history I should have given you, just so that you know what people are talking about when they mention military installations and so forth. And then we're going to open this up for a lot more experience. I see a lot of faces out there who know a lot about the Greenbelt. The history is on the screen, not in right order at the moment, but basically 500 years, 500 AD, I'm sorry, more than 500 years ago, is when the Duwamish ancestors we know were living in this area. They were dispossessed of the land by the Treaty of Point Elliott, subsequent actions of real estate developers in West Seattle. Most of the land was owned and logged by the Puget Milk Company in the late 1800s. And then when West Seattle was annexed to Seattle and taxes increased, property taxes, the company sold and donated much of what is now the Greenbelt to Seattle parks. The Olmsted brothers designed boulevards over the top of the ridge, which did not materialize, but the right of way is still there on plat maps. The streetcar line ran along the lower part of the Greenbelt, and if you visit the artifacts table afterwards, Craig Rankin will show you some of the items that he has collected from and found from this Lake Burien and Highland Park streetcar line. They eventually they got wiped out by a landslide, became too difficult to operate. Brickyards drew clay from the hillside. I've heard Ken talk about the blue clay that's on the hillside. And dumped kiln dust, as we have heard. Sand and gravel company mined the top of the ridge, creating the bare land where South Seattle College was built then and opened in 1970. During World War II, there were barrage balloons stationed on the highlands here, and those were balloons that were designed to prevent aircraft from coming, particularly over to the Boeing plant #1, which was at the base of Highland Point Parkway. A communication system was located on the top of the ridge, and then, as Kirsten mentioned, we need to conducted research in an underground facility there at Roxhill Park. There were also various proposals to put a highway over the top of the ridge and a lot of proposals at different times for housing. Always, we do see, I think, in the history of Greenbelt, this conflict between open space and the need for housing. So it seems to be a kind of a constant talk. Today, most of the Greenbelt, or much of it, at 500 acres, is owned by Seattle Parks and Recreation. It's the largest contiguous forest in the city. A lot of restoration, reforestation, planting of native plants has occurred to try and restore it to its original state. So that's the quick and dirty history, which is so in the slides that we could find and photographs we could find, and we hope that if any of you have old photographs, we have some contributed by Amy Holman from her family, which are very helpful, that you will bring those forward, and Southwest Seattle Historical Society will be helping us put together a history of the Greenbelt, and we need those photographs to illustrate it too. So, question about that?
This slideshow and others, is that on your website? Website?
Oh, it could eventually be on both. At the present, it's on neither. Just put it together for this day. We'll do that. Okay, at this point, this is the audience participation part, although we have some people I know who are ready to give us some more history. And what we'd like to hear is your stories of the Greenbelt. Keeping in mind that we're trying to establish an historical record here. You get the history from what people tell you, and what's not just the recorded history, even in newspapers. So that's what we want to hear. First of all, I'd like to hear from Robert as some stories and history.
Thanks. I led one of the hikes this afternoon, so forgive me if I repeat anything. I moved to West Seattle, specifically Pigeon Point, just a block from where the Pathfinder K-8 school is, in 1997, from the East Coast, where I grew up. And this was the Wild West to me. I had never lived on the West Coast, and I was surprised at first that it was very different from the East Coast in that history. On the East Coast, you can connect things back at least 300 years, and from there, you know that, the English came to settle Boston, etc. Here it was more about nature and the native populations that I quickly found out was the basis of the history here. And it seems to me still is the driving force behind the ecological activism and parks activism in Seattle. And it's really thrilling to me. When I moved to Pigeon Point, there were still some old timers, people who had lived there since the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, including people like Vivian McLean, who many of you her name may be familiar to you. Vivian was a very tough and very active person who scooped me up and said, "You've done community organizing, you're going to help fight the Curtis Mayer of Tacoma project that was going to bisect the Greenbelt just behind where Pathfinder is, with 110 condos. We were at the tail end of that fight when I got involved, but we prevailed. And in 2001, the city bought that property, and that was a major acquisition that prevented the Greenbelt from being pretty much destroyed north of where we are now. And then subsequently, so many other projects, community projects led by neighborhood groups and organizations like DNDA and the Nature Consortium to restore the habitat. And my theme for my hike today was that community involvement actually matters, and it actually can get you somewhere on down the line. And it doesn't happen in a vacuum. I think this is so important, what we're doing here today, because Judy mentioned the Olmsted brothers and the work they did. They were the sons of Frederick Law Olmsted, the famous landscape architect who designed Central Park in New York City. And they worked here in the late 19th century and early 20th century because the then city council, West Seattle was not part of Seattle. The city council decided we will expand. And even in those days, the city council was trying to think forward. And they wanted the Olmsted brothers to identify areas that should be preserved. And the West Duwamish Greenbelt area was one of them. It didn't quite work out as they hoped at first, but it's continuing. And I urge all of you to get involved on whatever level you feel comfortable doing, whether it be walking the trails, which is a help, whether it be joining West Duwamish Greenbelt organization, which is a help, or anything that you can do on any basis, whether occasional or regular, because it really helps. And even in my time here, I've seen enormous changes, and I encourage everybody to do that.
Okay, you don't have to come up here, we'll come to you, so who has a good story to tell? I know some of you. A question to the panelists is fine too. All right. Oh, I'm sorry, say your name if you want.
It's Mike York. My wife and I lived just north of the border for 38 years now. And I estimate I had probably 20,000 miles walking my dogs through the Greenbelt over the years. I had, and I asked Bob and Ed really, because I'm curious about the backstory of the McDonald Miller facility that's now from Reese on the Hill. Does anybody know how somebody came up with a great idea that we should go in and level that, put that facility in? The McDonald Miller facility, it's on the hill of Detroit Avenue.
The simple answer is it was keep property. Yeah, and that, so there was a big slide there. Only you're 1980 or so. Yes. There's a huge slide there, and then they had to go out and clean a bunch of the mud out of those power lines that go up there. Was a whole bunch of equipment parked there, and then next thing you knew, that chunk of land sold. Trying to think of McKidd Street, which is a competitor of Mac Miller was originally looking at it. And then I think like I blinked 10 years went by and Mac Miller's plant was there. And that's it. It was pretty sad because that area was a lot of fun to play when we were kids. Yeah.
And your name?
My name is Kevin Peterson.
Why don't you go ahead and tell some of those stories about
A question for Ken. What is the name of there's only one real island, I mean, original island still in this lower section of the river. It's right out here. Do you have a name for that, a tribal name for that?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Sure there is.
I think there is one, I've heard it before, I can't remember it is. I think it's officially called Kellogg Island, but that's not true. Because the first people that ever stepped on the island, ever in the history of mankind, around 1970 or something. My brother Mitchell, his buddy William, and his buddy Joel, and so we named that island Mawillo when we were little kids, and everybody in the neighborhood knew it as Mawillo Island until when they finally tore down that. There used to be a huge lumber mill across the street called Seaport Lumber. Kellogg Island and Seaport Lumber and all that inner channel was just the coolest place to come and explore as a kid. It's a lot better now that it's become a part of it. It's kind of a fun area to be.
What was the name? Where did you get your name from?
It was a mixture of the first names of the three guys that first when they crossed it. If the tide was up, you could walk across the floating logs. And if our parents found out, it would be a huge trouble because it fall between the logs and then they close up. And it wouldn't end well at all. But if the tide was all the way out, you could walk across the mud, but it was like hip deep. So when you wanted to explore the island, you tried to time it so the tide was up there. And the salmon, Ken will remember this, the salmon in this section of the river was like the water would be boiling in the fall. There was such a huge amount of salmon migrating up that river. I can't even describe what it was like. So look and see that. Of course, we don't see that now.
You know, I would concur with everything you said, up to and including the lumber mill that was across the street where I work. And then a little marina across the street. My dad had his boat.
Pioneer Marina, yeah.
And so I asked about the salmon, an older gentleman down in Riverside, 100 years old. And where are all the big fish? And he said, well, they went away. So I appreciate your memories. They're exactly right. And Christine over here, you just confirmed what we told ourselves as children. Oh, there's stuff going on behind that fence over there. Secret military base.
Yeah. Actually, very quick, I have two things I want to add. Most importantly, Mr. Rasmussen, we all need a good challenge when we're retired. The Lafarge property is a huge void in the entire Greenbelt that's privately owned, and as I'm sure you know, it's part of the Kiln Dust reclamation portion. It's now testing pretty good, and you should lobby the city to try to acquire that. It's right in the middle of the Greenbelt.
I'm glad you pointed that out. I've got a lot on my plate.
Not enough.
I'm getting some amount of volunteer work in the community for different community organizations, but it isn't up to just one person to get something like that done. It really requires a community. So if all of you want to advocate for that, I would encourage you, because this is a great time to be advocating for various things. Talk to candidates for city council. That this seat is going to be vacant. There is an election coming up for the city council seat, District 1. So if you have a cause that you want to ask a candidate about, whether it's Greenbelt's open space acquisition, talk to them, educate them. It's really, the campaign is an opportunity to educate candidates who may become city council members. They may not make a commitment or a promise to do something because they may not know enough about it or yet. But I would say, don't forget, this is a really good time to be meeting candidates, educating them, seeing if you get commitments to work with you on something that matters to you, should they become a city council member. Yes, this is a great opportunity. And I think it also would be good to talk to the Parks Department. Now, I love the Parks Department and staff, and I've worked with every superintendent going back to Walt Hundley, Dave Town, and beyond. As I said earlier, when we were talking about acquiring property for Greenbelt, they're really reluctant to take on much more unless there's a strong community support, strong community support for whatever you want to do, because it just means more responsibility, more work, more liability. It's not that they don't care, it's just like how much can one department do. So I think that it would also be good to start meeting with and talking to the Parks Department, if that's the appropriate department to be responsible for that site eventually. Talk to the mayor, talk to the Parks Department, say, we're really interested in this, we want you to support, find out what they think about that. Because if a department tells city council or the mayor they don't want something, that's a big hill to climb, you know, if you have to. Departments have a lot of, are given a lot of deference, and that's appropriate too, because they're going to eventually be responsible for maintaining or managing it.
Well, you can have Christine help you. She'll do it. One more quick thing. We used to call it the wireless station, the UW facility that's right above us. We live in the right center of the park, actually. And I can remember when I was a kid sneaking in there. That was like the holy grail of places you weren't supposed to go. So we crawl under the fence. And I remember a guy who, in my memory, he must have been in his 70s. And it couldn't have been your dad. That gray-haired guy, and that guy could run like a deer. No matter how good a shape you were in, he could catch it. And then he was the one to go. Thank you.
Well. Hold on a sec. Is there anybody here who has lived in the Greenbelt or near the Greenbelt for, let's say, 60 years? Okay. How about 7? All right, 60 seems to be it. I'd like to hear from those people eventually, but you mentioned that. So. Oh, I'd like to hear from them first. Okay.
Kevin, you were asking about the Longfellow Creek. So I heard, and in fact, he came through Dave Rasmussen, This came through James Rasmussen, and it used to be called Mud Island. And from what I've actually learned from Ken about the, the shoot seed language and the naming convention, that actually makes sense. Wouldn't you agree, Ken?
Yes, we don't name places after people. It's always after a thing.
Sorry.
This big rock, it's over where the tree is, the bend in the river. So if that was mud, that's what it would be called.
And historically, that island was a giant mud flat. Although there's trees on it now, the reason you see trees on it was because of filling that happened, when they started dredging and straightening the Duwamish River, and other materials were deposited there, whether it be dredge spoils, and even some cement kiln dust. So once the elevation was risen in that southern part of the island, that then allowed trees to be established from, any sort of seeds and various things that would eventually land on it.
And your name?
Joanna Floor, and I'm with the West Duwamish Greenbelt Trails.
Okay. Who would like? Thank you. Say your name.
I'm Steve Richmond, and I've actually sort of been in the neighborhood 60 years exactly. I was 2 years old when we moved here, so I went to the old Cooper School and remember having the run of the woods, which was wonderful. And vaguely remember Ken. He was a little slightly older than me, but we do have recollection. But I do have great memories, growing up with green space, and but I do have two causes I just want to touch on. One is I love Ken's optimistic memory of the woods, and it's still there, the structure's still there, but I've become concerned about invasive ivy and holly that slowly creeps in. So I've actually developed a career around that. And the plug I want to give you all, just to educate yourself, is a website called seedrain.org, and it has to do with invasive seed sources on private land that reinfests the Greenbelt. So it's one word, SEEDRAIN. Seed rained down by bird, basically. And the other cause is Puget Creek Watershed Alliance. So I live not far from where Stanislaw School is on Myrtle. And on 19th Avenue Southwest, there used to be a pond that people used to ice skate on back when it was cold enough. Back when there was a pond. That pond was drained for a playground that was asphalted. And we're in the process as a neighborhood of trying to restore that. And I wasn't environmentally conscious in 1990 when Puget Ridge neighbors lobbied for green space money that bought 7 acres of wetland right near the Puget Ridge Headwaters Park across from I forgot the street name, but thank you, Brandon, and 18th and 19th there. And that park prevented a road from being built and developed up to basically Stanislaw. So we have this a 3 block wide green space that is basically protected people's actually big yards. So people that live on that Puget Creek watershed can basically plant vegetation and clean up after their dogs and things like that, and help create a clean Puget Creek. So there's lots of work to do. That's it.
Well, we might add that Puget Creek, so can you give us a brief history of Puget Creek?
Well, I remember it flowed year round when I was a kid. And then there was actually a road that was planned to be built. So there was a sanitary sewer pipe put in basically beneath the creek. And that drain rock around the pipe took away the flow, the year-round flow. So Puget Creek still goes through a lot of very protected watershed through Puget Park. And there was an ecologist at the Port of Seattle, George, I forgot his last name.
Palmer.
I think so, yeah. And
He's still there.
And he just put it in my head that Puget Creek has the best chance at perhaps some salmon recovery because it's more protected. The watershed is more protected. So if somehow we can get flow back into that creek. And when I picked up the baton of Puget Creek Watershed Alliance, I thought, well, maybe everybody could just put their hoses on back. But there are other avenues like tertiary water treatment technology that could possibly do that, but rain gardens help. But anyway, Puget Creek goes down toward, winds down. We basically walk the path this morning, winds down toward West Marginal Way, and then we're piped beneath West Marginal Way, basically almost, I think, under the Longhouse. And then it crosses West Marginal Way and goes out a quarter mile north of us. And the goal is to daylight Puget Creek, somehow get it underneath West Marginal Way and have it outflow in its historic place in the park. How do we pronounce that part? Yeah. Yeah. So that's basically it. And I recently moved to Vashon, but I still have deep connections here, and I'd like to continue that work slowly. And so anyway, I'm here. Back. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Amy Thompson, and we live literally 2 houses west of here, up the hill. And I walked down the hill and didn't break a leg. We moved here in October of 2000. And I kind of wanted to talk about the cement kiln dust and how that's shaped our neighborhood. Because our neighborhood is the way it is because John Yates and John McFarland decided to fill the Puget Creek ravine with cement kiln dust, which has arsenic, cadmium, lead, and mercury. And I have a picture dating from 1971 that looks like somebody dropped a giant bag of flour from outer space, right in Puget Park, right in that sort of southern and eastern part of Puget Park. It's the cement kiln dust. The city swears up, down, and sideways that it's not under the road, but I have the picture to prove that it is. But because of the cement kiln dust, our neighborhood is very small. And we fought to keep it that way. I moved here at the tail end of the Curtis Meyer development project. There was another guy who wanted to put in 33 houses up there, skinny little 15-foot wide houses on 25-foot wide lots, 5-foot lot lines. We fought it all the way up to the hearing examiners and lost, but it was 2008. The housing crisis basically crushed this guy. I feel so bad. I was asking the Florida developer to treat it even better if I grew up in Miami. Anyway, we have no fire hydrant because the city refuses to put a water main, but they just permitted 9 houses up there. Same little shoebox houses. And they're gonna put a water main through that cement kiln dust. And I don't know how they get away with it. But I love living there. It's like living in the city. And living in the country 10 minutes from downtown. And I was fortunate enough to live across the street from a woman who grew up in that neighborhood and only left it like a year or 2 ago. So I have lots of her memories talking about the soldiers whistling at her when she was hanging out wash on her line. And that this hill used to be called Boeing Hill. And that the joke was about the brick plant was that the clay would come down to the brick plant because of the slope of the hill and just sort of landslide its way down to the creek plant. But I would really, really love to see the city actually address the acres of cement that's there. And I know we're not the only site, I know there's 28 other sites all over West Seattle in this stuff. And I don't even know where to start, because it feels like the city doesn't care and can't.
I want to say something about the current day cement dust, so. Not sure how many of you are familiar with our Caspian terns, the dinosaurs that fly over. So the cement dust impacts wildlife as well, and the reason they nest on, well, their nest site, historical nest site at T106 was demolished in January. But the reason they chose that site was when they got flushed from their huge colony. They saw the cement dust and they think it's sand, and so they nested on the roof for several years. And then in 2021, when we had the heat dome, the babies had to jump off of the roof because it was too hot, and so they lost about 200 ticks that year. And then last year they had a predation event with the peregrine falcons from underneath the bridge, who have since both passed from bird flu. But they moved up to the Coast Guard building, but they lay their eggs 2.5 months behind schedule, and those eggs also perished. So 2 years in a row, they've had nesting catastrophes. So just a little note about cement dust.
You said Caspian terns, right? Yeah. Don't they nest on Long Island?
No. It's too tidal
Okay,
and too many predators, but they do hang out there.
right. Did we have another 60-year residence? Was that right? Thank you. And give your name?
Ken Workman, I met you 3 or 4 years ago, some walk around here or something like that. My name is Joel, and I'm in Seattle. I was born in the Seattle area, and I had an interesting experience in 2017. I do live in West Seattle. I have since 2000, but I went off to college and grad school and came back to my hometown. First time I lived in West Seattle was 2000, and in 2017, I started sort of poking around on Google Earth and looking at weird parks in West Seattle because I wanted to hit all the pocket parks, and I discovered a place called College Street Ravine. Does anyone know that place? Okay. And as I sat there and I went in there and I would spend time in there, obviously, do you know it, Ken? No. Okay. What's the Pacific Northwest landform? It's going to have scrapes and spars that run north and south. Why? Glaciers and plate tectonics. Those are the two reasons why Lake Washington is 20-something miles north-south and in places 2 miles wide. So I'm looking at this park, and if you know College Street Ravine, it runs east-west. It's 1,000 feet long and 80 feet wide and 40 feet deep, and it's a gash in the earth. And I think I must have spent 30 or 40 hours revisiting that park until it finally dawned on me. This must have been a huge earthquake. And then the northern triangle of West Seattle, the northern 1 mile equilateral triangle tip, the northern West Seattle slid northward like 150 feet during this earthquake. And I looked it up, and you've heard of the Great Cascadia earthquake, haven't you? Yeah. And so what that means is that by the way, Great Cascadia earthquake, you find it on Wikipedia, stretched from the northern end of Vancouver Island to the southern end of San Francisco Bay, and it came in 28 days into the 1700s. January 28th, 1700, in the evening or the early evening. And we know the date because the Japanese have a record of many of their villages getting destroyed by a tsunami. They call it the coast tsunami. They kept records. So that's when it happened, and that was essentially 6 months before the first Russian traders came down from Alaska. I mean, and yet it was clearly trauma, like all of the landslide that we see around here is generally from that. And when we find a swamp on a slope, that doesn't make sense at all in deposition. I mean, that is just not how rivers work. And when you find swamp plants on a slope, that's because there's some clay chunk that came down and captures that water and the water really can't drink. And I'm sure, I haven't spent enough time in the Greenbelt, but I'm sure you could find swamp plants in there. And obviously, College Creek Ravine is like, if an earthquake is an act of God, that place almost feels chapel-like. It's pointing due west at the sunset. It's amazing. And it's clearly only 300 something years old as a thing. So my question, because I'm getting there, Ken Workman, what does the Duwamish tribe have to say in their stories about that incident?
On that particular line, I'm not sure, but you might be describing. Well, I'm thinking about the one where there was Thunderbird, an earthquake monster, and over at Agate Pass, where there's this great struggle and waves. There was a great struggle between the two, and there was a time period in that, so that it's legends, Indian legends. Earthquake monster, earthquake monster, and Thunderbird. And Thunderbird.
What is an earthquake monster?
It's two-headed serpent kind of thing. You see it in a lot of our drawings. And so, we have these things.
It's huge. It's the largest earthquake in 10,000 years from America. Like 9.4. That's lasted for 15 minutes.
It very well could, and we also know that Lake Washington was a saltwater lake once, but everything changed out here.
Yeah.
And so there's stories around different places. Don't go there. It's real bad stuff will happen to you. You go to this place, or you go to that rock over there.
Do you believe that after the earthquake, Native Americans would go into College Creek Ravine because it was a gash that got created in the road overnight?
No, I'm not saying that.
But you do bring up a question that we've raised too about the ponds around in the Greenbelt. And I think you referred to a sandbar pond and Lost Pond, and put a picture of it here. Does anybody know the origin of Lost Pond, or where was Sandbar Pond? Steve mentioned the skating place, and I've heard somebody else has talked about that. That was a wetland, but anybody know origin of Lost Pond or what was Sandbar Pond?
So where Steve talked about, I think it was Malvern's pond when we were kids, it was before they built Santa's Hall. And I believe that's why, I think Steve agrees with this. The creek in the summertime, the lowest the creek ever got is about where we have it, where we see it right now. And today the creek is dried up, and I think it's because the wetland is actually a little bog underneath the asphalt up there. Sandbar Pond is on the hill below South Seattle College. And that area was farmed, small farms in the 1920s or something like that. You can see it if you look at some of the historical photos of the area photos, you can see them. And I believe the pond is a natural formation, but I believe it was dredged for irrigation water or something. And so that's, and it's just a really cool area. That there's a plum grove that still produces a lot of fruit in the middle of the woods down there. And where the pond is, creek is, it's a fantastic place. There's a just north of Sandbar Pond. Get what you got. Yeah, I was thinking of the story. No, north of Sandbar Pond is something we always refer to as the meadow. It's like, my memory is 500 feet long, but it was probably 50 feet long. And it's the most beautiful natural grass I'd ever seen. We used to go down to the plum grove and forage on plums until we were sick, and then we lay in that tall grass and this summertime kids, you know, it was just a perfect place to grow up.
Is the sandbar pond the same as Lost Pond?
It is, yeah. And I concede that maybe I got it wrong, but it was always sandbar pond.
Name it, I don't know where Lost Pond name was.
Explain about the cement and dust and what that all means.
Can I just take that on the reading? Because that's about that. So in
What's the question?
describe the kiln dust. We always call it limestone dust, but the cement mill needed to dispose of their waste product for manufacturing cement. Used to be Columbia Cement. And the man who developed the riding stables and cut all the trails with a little small bulldozer. And his partner who lived, he owned a huge part of what is they're now calling the Heron's Nest.
Yeah.
Those two got together and sold the dumping rights to this area where the stables were. So it's park property. The park had released it for rent-free use for the stables. And then there was, I don't know, there was confusion and dishonesty, but he felt like he had a right to give away, to utilize and make money on the property after the horse stables failed. So they were bringing in trucks and trucks and trucks of this white, nasty stuff. And it was just an amazing, over the course of a couple of months, all of a sudden we had literally a mountain of this yellow, white nastiness down there. My mother, who was just a fantastic person, and she was a very active community activist. She led a little bit of a charge, and we got Como TV here when I was a kid. I remember it was a big deal. And we ultimately, the neighborhood stopped that, but there was no cleanup effort. And then when they started to investigate it, they also sold, there's lead acid batteries buried up there.
Yeah.
Hundreds of them. I mean, and you know, the lead itself will never go away. And the city's solution was to cap it. But then we dug deeper and we realized that apparently the byproduct from limestone dust floats. So capping it is a great temporary solution, but in theory, at a molecular level, that's going to rise to the surface over time. And that's the way it's going to be. And I have one more thing to tell you. I lost my mother to lymphoma when she was 56 years old. And this area has a tremendous high density occurrences of lymphatic cancers. And she always felt like it was either, sorry about this, but it was either the testing facility at the University of Washington had back when they used to test there, or most likely she also felt like it was limestone dust and the cement and stuff that Mr. Armstrong used to get. Thank you.
That kiln dust is washing out from under the cab. And when I was fighting the 2008 land use fight up here, I looked at the file of the Department of Ecology on that cement kiln dust. And they literally landscaped Puget Park to keep people out. And now we're building trails through it. So, you know, I appreciate that you guys are trying to avoid the areas where the kiln dust is, and that's a really good idea. But when I've had to clean the ditch that runs along Puget Way, I get this soapy feel on my fingers from the alkali from the kiln dust. It's still there.
That answer your question, and it was that.
19.
I'm gonna get 1970. I have a huge folder on it somewhere.
Yes. All right, anybody else?
Happy memories here.
Is, one question, is Kenny Nelson here? All right, I wanted to hear the story of biking and biking in the Greenbelt, and all of a sudden one day coming up to a cliff with a gravel mine.
So, well, this is the secondhand story, and I probably should forget it. But something that Craig, I think you've heard it too, is that he and his friends would bike in the Greenbelt, and one day they're kind of coming up the road, maybe in Highland Park, whatever. And all of a sudden, they're just at the edge of a cliff where the gravel mine has created a big hole. Is that the way you remember it, Craig? Kenny Nelson. Yeah. Okay.
So kind of hard to engage. So I think the way you said, the gate at the bottom of the gravel road, we call it the hill. It used to be there, there was this ginormous, they were a big. Close. Yeah, you can actually be over. You can actually be over on Park Avenue if you really got a good run at it. And my favorite memory of that is the rope rotted or got taken by somebody. So somebody had the right idea and they put a garden hose on that same branch. And then, of course, the garden hose broke. And so they fell all the way down into the blackberry bushes and all along said, don't worry. We're playing down there.
Okay, one last question or comment? Any questions for the panelists before we wrap up? Any comments from our panelists before we wrap up?
No, other than thanks for the memories.
So, Ken, how do you pronounce Seattle in the Lashute, your ancestral thing?
Well, there's all kinds of ways you can pronounce it. You can say self, you can say Seattle, some people say Seattle, is really probably the most accurate. If you look at the language and you drop the S, because S nominalizes the name, and then you drop the I, because the I is a linking vowel, you end up with what the rest of it sounds like, Adam. But we say Adam, when in fact it could be a barred lambda, which is not a full sound. So if I were to say just the last things that I said, I'd say apple. And then, of course, because I nominalize it, because I'm nominalizing the thing, then it would be it's apple. So that's just me. Sure. So you're allowed to pronounce it any way you want. That's great, because in doing so, you're not actually saying the proper name. That's always good.
All right.
Thank you all for your comments.
That means, oh.
Yeah.
It's sort of over encompassing the southwest. However you think you might use it.
Beautiful. And do you know any much about it?
It's just First, post office puts out these stamps, and they put the envelopes on, first day they put them out.
Yeah.
So that's all this is, it's just, in Western Territory, it's 53, so
Yeah.
probably 1853. With this Social Security. This first governor.
Yeah, Stevens, yeah. Yeah, very cool. Well, thank you.
I don't have a clue.
Yeah, I just wanted to say congratulations.